Shall move to questions without notice. Are there any questions? I give the call to the honourable member for Banks.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Communications. The government has been sitting on its hands for 498 days since the former member for Dunkley, the late Peter Murphy, handed down her report on the harm caused by online gambling. Around the time of her passing, the Prime Minister said of Ms Murphy that she, quote, led the charge on reducing the harm caused by online gambling. When will this government make a decision in relation to online gambling reforms, a decision very much on the minds of the Australian people?
The call to the Minister for Communications.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and I thank the member for his question. I'm sure everyone in this place has constituents, everyone in this place knows someone who has been personally impacted by the scourge of what happens when people have addictive problems with gambling, and the fact that this is costing our economy some $25 billion a year. The government is considering very carefully and consulting widely on the recommendations that was contained in the late Peter Murphy's report. It's important to note that there are issues in this report that go not only to issues of federal responsibility but also to states and territories. That is why we are doing this in a coordinated way, and we are making good progress. Mr Speaker, it's interesting to hear some of the interjections from those opposite, because if only the Leader of the Opposition had been a senior cabinet minister for 10 years in a government that could have done something about this. If only. Mr Speaker, they talk about sitting on their hands. In the previous government, Mr Speaker, a report was put out to ban the use of credit cards for online wagering. And what happened?
The Minister for Social Services.
Nothing. Absolutely nothing. It was up to us to implement it.
Order. Member for Moreton is warned. The member for Banks is entitled to a point of order.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. On relevance, the question was very clear, which was when will the government make a decision on gambling reforms, and the minister should be asked to address that question.
The minister has made reference to that part of the question. She needs to make sure she's being directly relevant. She has been mentioning the report, and she is entitled to do some compare and contrast, but the remainder of the answer simply cannot be about any other thing than the topic that she's addressing, not opposition policy, but I'll listen carefully to make sure she is being directly relevant.
And Mr Speaker, as we work through this as an orderly cabinet government that consults with people, we will ensure that we satisfy three key areas. First, to ensure that children are protected. Secondly, to break that nexus between sport and online wagering, because we know that under the previous government, and this goes to the issue of effectiveness, Mr Speaker, we know that under the previous government, when they tinkered with these rules, it resulted in an increase in advertising. We will be forward-looking and comprehensive, and we also want to ensure that we address that particular cohort that is at risk, which is young men who are being targeted with that advertising to a saturation level. We are determined to get this right. We are determined that not only will this complement the many efforts that we have made in this area, including the implementation of BetStop, which has seen over 20,000 people self-exclude themselves. Again, Mr Speaker, this going to the issue of we had to pick this up from the National Consumer Protection Framework. It was not done. We've picked all these things up, including the wagering ban, including making sure that we had the Stevens review that had been buried under the previous government, making sure that it was implemented, and we will get this right and we will get this done, and it will have a measurable difference on gambling harms in this country.
The call to the honourable member for Lingiari.
Thank you, Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. Prime Minister, how will a social media age limit for children under 16 years old help keep young people safe online, and why is this so important, Prime Minister?
The call to the Prime Minister.
I thank the member for Lingiari for her question, and she is just one of the many members of this parliament who've made representations about the harm that social media is doing to our young Australians. Well, today, Mr Speaker, the government is calling time on it. Cabinet has approved a minimum age of 16 years to access social media, and tomorrow I will convene National Cabinet to seek support for national legislation to be introduced by the end of this year. I want Australian parents and families to know that we have your back. I want to give children a childhood and give parents peace of mind. The onus will be on social media companies, not parents or young people. There will be no penalties for users. The E-Safety Commissioner will provide oversight and enforcement. I do thank the Minister for Communications for her determination and her focus. This has been a priority for this Minister, and she has been a relentless champion for the well-being of our young people. But I also want to be grateful for the work of civil society. The Let Kids Be Kids campaign, the 36 Months campaign have all been really important. And this morning I met with Matt and Kelly O'Brien, parents of Charlotte, who tragically lost her life. I spoke to Kelly a few weeks ago, and this is an unspeakable tragedy to lose one's child. I met with Rob Evans, the father of Liv Evans. No parent should ever go through what they have gone through. No parent should ever have to call on the sort of courage that they have shown in speaking out on behalf of others. And I'm very grateful for their advocacy, and I pay tribute to them today. Government has a responsibility to do everything we can to help as many young Australians as we can. We are stepping up and providing national leadership, and I'm confident that tomorrow, when the National Cabinet meets, we will ensure that there is a single system going forward to ensure uniformity. That is so important. We know that this isn't the only solution. We know there's more to do. We know that there's a ban on young people buying alcohol, and from time to time, under 18s do get access. But that's not a reason to walk away from sending that message and putting in place the support for parents that they need and are calling for in order to support the children in their families.
Call to the Honourable the Deputy Leader of the Opposition.
My question is to the Minister for Skills and Training and the former Minister for Immigration. Of the 500,000 people—
Order. Order. Members on my right, we're not going to have people giving commentary because I'm going to hear from the Leader of the House.
Mr Speaker, the standing orders don't allow questions on the basis that people are former ministers. If they did, there'd be lots of questions through a former Minister for the Environment. But that's not what the standing orders are here for. Oh, and health, of course.
Order. So, the Deputy Leader knows that a Minister can't be asked about any responsibilities in a former portfolio, just as she knew when she was a Minister as well. So we'll just restart the question and probably don't need that part of the question. That's an extra that everyone knows but doesn't need to be added to the question. Order. The Deputy Leader has the call.
My question is to the Minister for Skills and Training. Of the 500,000 people who have enrolled in fee-free TAFE courses, how many have dropped out of their course?
Order. Members on my left, we don't need sound effects and commentary. The Minister for Skills and Training has the call. Order.
Thank you, Speaker, and I thank the Deputy Leader. I really do thank her for another question about fee-free TAFE, and actually it's 508,000 who have enrolled in fee-free TAFE in the data that we have to hand. And our focus is on opening the doors of opportunity to them, to see them get through and attain qualifications or pathways to employment. She should be aware that the data custodian doesn't actually keep that data set. We are much more focused on ensuring that people get the skills that they need to enter into employment.
Order. Members on my left, there is far too much noise. The Minister is going to pause. The Minister for Social Services will cease interjecting. Order. The Minister was asked for a number in the question. As the chamber knows, under the standing orders, I can't compel a minister to give a number, and whether it be a yes-no response, a figure or a fact. So whilst the minister, I can't compel, and I know that's what the Deputy Leader is after, I can compel him to be directly relevant about the question, about the numbers of people who are enrolled in FETRAFE, about the difficulties around the project. But I'll hear from the Deputy Leader of the Opposition because she's entitled to raise a point of order.
It is a point of order on relevance, Mr Speaker, and I appreciate your remarks about a precise number, but the question addressed the number of dropouts, of completions. The only thing the Minister is addressing is commencements, and he is clearly out of order and not relevant. And if he doesn't know the answer, he should just say so. Order.
It's not the time to add extra comments. So the Minister was asked a tight question. Order. The Prime Minister will cease interjecting. This places the chair in a position where I want to enforce the standing orders, so I'm going to ensure that the minister is being directly relevant, but I'm also asking for the chamber to listen with respect and courtesy to the minister as well. The minister has the call.
Thank you, Speaker. In fact, maybe they should have been listening because I did directly go to the question. The Shadow Minister could perhaps listen. She could perhaps also have regard to the explanation that was given in estimates last night of this issue and the data that we keep. I say again, though, we are interested in free TAFE providing Australians with the skills that they want to get gainful employment, and I'm frankly baffled that the Leader of the Opposition, the Deputy Leader of the Opposition want to talk this down. They want to pick a fight not with us but with 508,000 Australians and their families. In the same way that they want to make life harder for 3 million Australians with student debt. Student debt including debt that got a lot worse under them.
The Minister was not asked about student debt. He was asked about the program is responsible for. So I'm just going to give him one more chance.
Thank you, Speaker.
Otherwise, he'll have to conclude his answer.
Thank you, Speaker. I did go to that. What we are focused on is ensuring that Australians, through free TAFE, get the skills they want and our economy needs. We've been through the issues about how the data is collected by the independent data custodian. And we know, Speaker, that free TAFE works because of the Victorian experience, where many more people are completing their courses than university students, many more people than across the vet sector broadly, around 54%. For those who aren't listening, around 54% in the Victorian experience of those who are completing. This is why we have put in a bill to make free TAFE enduring. The question for members opposite is, are they going to support it or are they going to walk away from public TAFE and all of those students?
Give the call to the Honourable Order. The call to the member for Holt.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Communications. How is the Albanese Labor government helping parents keep their kids safe online?
Give the call to the Minister for Communications.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and I thank the member for her question. The Albanese government is focused on positive solutions to issues of national concern, and the safety and mental health of our young people is paramount. The welfare of children is a collective responsibility, and it's heartening to see the Commonwealth and states working together in this important effort. Social media, of course, offers many benefits to Australians, but it is also a source of harm. And too often, social media isn't social at all. And as the mother of 2 young daughters, I understand the anxiety of parents about the impacts of social media, the screen addiction of their children, and we are on their side. The fact is social media has a social responsibility for the safety and well-being of children, but they are falling short. And while a government may not be able to prevent every harm on the internet, there is always more we can do to make a difference. And that's why the Albanese government is legislating a minimum age for access to social media. As the Prime Minister has outlined, tomorrow he will convene National Cabinet and recommend that 16 be legislated as the minimum age. The government will introduce legislation this year with an implementation period of a year from when the legislation is passed. Mr Speaker, our legislation will be a world first. This is a national challenge that requires national leadership, and that's why we've worked closely with the states and territories and taking strong action. Consistent with the design principles I outlined in October, National Cabinet will consider a proposal that includes the onus being on social media platforms to prevent access, and there will not be penalties for parents or young people. A new definition of age-restricted social media platform will be adapted from the existing Online Safety Act definition for the purposes of the age limit. We will prioritise privacy protection for information collected for age assurance purposes. There will not be grandfathering arrangements, and the age limit will apply to holding an account and will allow access to social media in a logged-out state. I want to make it clear that our legislation is about the protection and not the isolation of young people. Determining the age of 16 was not arrived at lightly, but we are confident this is the right decision. The normative value of 16 is immense, and it will establish new expectations within society about social media use. The government has consulted widely to determine the basis for our decision, including with experts, parents, youth organisations, academics, and of course our state and territory colleagues. And I want to thank all who have engaged constructively on this issue. Your insights have guided our thinking, and there's so many personal experiences, such as those the Prime Minister and I heard this morning, to add to our determination to get this right. Responding to these concerns has been the focus of the Albanese government because the safety of our children comes first.
Before I call the honourable member for Wentworth, I'm pleased to inform the House that present in the gallery today are participants in the University of Canberra's Pathway to Politics program, which aims to equip diverse women with the skills and knowledge to drive change through political leadership. And also in the House today is Professor Philip Klingon, OAM, a talented and dedicated oncologist, cancer researcher and patron of the Illawarra Cancer Carers. His tireless work, advocacy and fundraising drives have made significant contributions to improving services in the area and providing that support to those suffering from cancer. Welcome to you all. The call to the honourable member for Wentworth.
My question is to the Assistant Treasurer. Organised crime syndicates are scamming Australian households who are losing life-changing sums of money, including in Wentworth. 94% of scam losses are borne by individuals and only 6% by banks. This is despite banks having far greater tools at their disposal to stop scams. Does the Minister think that consumers are responsible for and have the ability to prevent 94% of scam losses? And if not, will you take action to make sure banks and other companies pay for losses in proportion to their ability to prevent them?
Call to the Assistant Treasurer and Minister for Financial Services.
Thanks, Deputy Speaker. Thank you, Speaker, and can I thank the member for Wentworth for the question and her ongoing engagement on this issue. Can also take the opportunity to thank my colleague, the Minister for Communications, on the work that we've been doing together, a team effort to ensure that we keep Australians' money safe and their information safe. Friends, earlier today I introduced the new Scams Prevention Framework Bill into the Parliament. When legislated, it'll ensure that Australia is the toughest country in the world for these multinational crime syndicates that the member for Wentworth refers to make a dollar. And that's our objective, to ensure that Australians are kept safe, and this is the toughest country in the world for the criminals to prey upon Australians. I'm asked about the approach that we've taken and how it differs from other approaches. I've got to say, it is in this particular regard that we differ from the approach of our predecessors. The approach under our predecessors was, if you get scammed, you're a mug and you're on your own. And they were soft on financial crime, they were soft on financial criminals, and as a result, scam losses on their watch doubled and then doubled and then doubled again.
The Minister will pause. The The member for Wentworth was on her feet before the member for Wannon, and I'll hear from her as the order. As the person who has asked the question, they shall have the first right to take a point of order.
The point is on relevance. I didn't ask about alternative approaches. I asked specifically about the losses borne by consumers versus the losses borne by banks and ability to prevent them.
For consistency, the member for Wentworth is correct, and under the Speaker's direction, I'm just going to ask the Minister to refrain from talking about alternative approaches or policies and to return to the question.
Thank you. The focus of our legislation and the focus of the question is around how we prevent scams occurring in the first place, and when they do occur, how we ensure the victims are compensated. That's the whole focus of the legislation. It introduces tough new obligations. These obligations will fall upon banks, but also on telecommunications companies and social media platforms, and I'll return to this point in a moment. Tough obligations to ensure that they are keeping their customers safe. Obligations to prevent scams, obligations to detect scams, obligations to disrupt scams, obligations to report scams, and obligations to ensure that they are responding, including responding to their customers to ensure that their money and their information is safe. I agree with the member for Wentworth that not nearly enough is being done by banks to ensure that their customers are being kept safe and that they are getting compensated for losses. That is a core feature of our scheme. Clear paths for remediation, clear paths for compensation. But we do not accept the approach that has been pushed by some others, that we should let social media platforms off the hook, because 2 out of every 3 scams originates from an ad published on a social media platform. Meta in and of itself is the single biggest advertiser of criminal scams in the world. They're not a start-up. In Australia, they made between $5 and $6 billion last year alone. So yes, we need to keep the banks on the hook and keep the banks responsible for their part in the harms, but we should also be ensuring the big companies like Meta and social media are kept to account as well.
Call to the honourable member for Werriwa.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Treasurer. What progress is the Albanese Labor government making in the fight against inflation? What obstacles are standing in the way?
Call to the Treasurer.
I thank you, Mr Speaker, and I thank the member for Werriwa. I also wanted to acknowledge the great work that the Assistant Minister is making when it comes to financial security, and we heard some of that a moment ago. Cost of living is the major pressure on people in our communities, and it's the #1 focus of this Labor government. We're coming at this cost of living challenge from every conceivable, every responsible angle, whether it's the tax cuts, the energy bill relief, cheaper medicines, cheaper early childhood education, rent assistance, wage increases, and the changes that we're making to student debt. Now, we know that the official data doesn't always capture precisely how people are faring, but we have seen inflation come off really considerably in our economy. When we came to office, it was much higher and rising. Now it's lower and falling. It had a 6 in front of it under those opposite. It now has a 2 in front of it. And because of that, headline inflation is now back in the target band for the first time since 2021. As the Secretary of the Treasury said yesterday, as I said yesterday, as the Governor of the Reserve Bank said today, the Reserve Bank targets headline inflation, but underlying inflation is important as well. And both headline and underlying inflation—
The Treasurer will pause. I'm just not going to have the member for Hume continually giving commentary right throughout this answer. Okay? So it's just not on. We just can't have this continual just commentary. So no more interjections to the remainder of this answer, and the House will be a lot better. The Treasurer has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. The member for Hume is desperately unhappy because both headline inflation and underlying inflation went down in the data last week, and it went down in the forecasts from the Reserve Bank this week, Mr Speaker.
Order.
Now, it has been—
The Minister for Climate Change and Energy will cease interjecting. No, members on my right, The manager is entitled to raise a point of order, and I won't have this being disrupted while he raises it. The point of order.
Standing orders are very clear on imputations of improper motives. To suggest, as the Treasurer just did, that the Shadow Treasurer is, quotes, desperately unhappy, is to impute improper motives to him. This Treasurer does it all the time, and he should be required to comply with the standing orders.
Member, order. Just the member for Groom. No, we're not giving commentary. We're going to listen to each other and show each other respect. The Deputy Leader of the House.
Thank you, Speaker. Happiness or unhappiness is not a motive, and I encourage the Manager of Opposition Business to have a look at the Shadow Treasurer's face.
Order. All right, we're going to handle it this way. For the remainder of the answer, I'm just going to require the Treasurer not to refer to other members at all. Just get through the answer and not refer to any other members. Order. And I just want to listen to the Treasurer. He has the call.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. The point I'm making is that last week both headline inflation and underlying inflation went down, and in the forecast the Reserve Bank released this week, they have lowered their forecasts for both important measures of inflation. And the fact that today marks 1 year exactly since interest rates last went up reflects the progress that we are making when it comes to inflation. And this fight against inflation is our #1 focus. And the Governor again acknowledged that today when she said, and I'm quoting the Governor of the Reserve Bank, "I think the attitude at the moment that I'm hearing from the government is the right one," end quote, from the Governor of the Reserve Bank. The same Governor who said our surpluses are helping and our cost of living relief will help, Mr Speaker. Now, I say to those opposite, Mr Speaker, stop trying to diminish what Australians have achieved together in our economy under this Prime Minister and under his government. Inflation's halved, real wages growing again, 1 million new jobs, tax cuts for every taxpayer, 2 surpluses, less debt, Mr Speaker. Now, we're not there yet, but we have made a lot of welcome progress, and we know that the opposition leader is a risk to this progress because we know his record, gutting Medicare, pushing wages down, pushing prices up. And these are the costs, Mr Speaker, of his reckless arrogance. His reckless arrogance will have real costs for ordinary people who are doing it tough enough and would be doing it tougher without...
Order. We'll hear from the honourable member for Wannon.
Thanks, Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. Yesterday, the ankle bracelets and monitoring conditions were removed from 215 dangerous non-citizen offenders, including 12 murderers, 66 sex offenders, 97 people convicted of assault and 15 domestic violence perpetrators. How many of the hardened criminals who are in the community are wearing ankle bracelets or subject to curfews right now?
Call to the Leader of the House.
Thanks very much, Mr Speaker. If I can, first of all, the decision from the High Court that's been referred to there is not the decision that the government wanted, but it is a decision that we had prepared for. And so this morning I was with the Governor-General signing in new regulations, and those new regulations allow what was cut out by the High Court yesterday to now go through reconsideration on a new test, which is viewed as being legal, and for that new test to be applied to the full caseload. Of course, let's not forget that the concept of people in these circumstances being on ankle bracelets at all is something that has only started since this government. It was previously the case, for example, that 102 sex offenders were released from immigration detention by the Leader of the Opposition with no conditions at all. No conditions at all.
I'm just going to invite the Leader of the House to pause because I want to hear from the member for Wannon.
Thanks, Speaker, and it goes to relevance, and this question is incredibly important to the safety of the Australian people. It was to be directly relevant, you have to ask how many are subject to ankle bracelets and curfews right now.
Order. On the point of order, the Deputy Leader of the House.
To the point of order, Mr Speaker, it's quite clear in practice that a minister is able to compare and contrast, provided that does not take the entirety of their answer.
Yes, practice page 554 does go to that area. So the minister has been referring to the question. He is being directly relevant. He is entitled to talk about the policy topic. He won't be able to remain for the remainder of his answer, particularly about alternative policies, but while he's been going for about 20 seconds on that topic, he's entitled to do so under the standing orders and practice. But I'll listen carefully to make sure he is being directly relevant, and he has the call.
Thanks very much, Mr Speaker. So therefore, the new test and the new rules have been in place since this morning. Within 24 hours of the High Court coming down with its decision, the government had taken 3 actions. The first action that we took was to make sure that we had increased the number of people on Border Force under Operation AUKUS. That's been an increase that we were stepping up in anticipation of the possibility of this decision, so that that operation in Border Force now has 2/3 additional people, 66% increase on the number of people who were there working on that. Secondly, the regulation was signed off by me. It had to be, obviously, we had to check it against the specifics of the majority ruling in the High Court. That was signed off by me last night, put through the Executive Council this morning, and now being applied by the department. Thirdly, legislation had to be introduced to the House. The regulation takes immediate effect. Obviously, people then have to be tested against it, but the regulation takes immediate effect. Additional to that, legislation is required, which isn't required for the reg to take immediate effect, but is required for us to have all the full powers that we want to be able to have, and that legislation was introduced before question time today. All of that has happened with a High Court decision that only came down yesterday. This government's first priority is community safety. And if I can remind members, the first priority is not ankle bracelets or detention for these people. Our first priority is we don't want them in Australia at all, and that is why we introduced powers today in the legislation to improve the government's capacity to remove people from this country in that situation.
Call to the honourable member for Cunningham.
Thank you, Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Education. What is the Albanese Labor government doing to support Australian students and build a better and fairer education system? And what has been the response?
Call to the Minister for Education.
Thanks, Mr Speaker. Can I thank my mate, the cracking member for Cunningham, for her question? Mr Speaker, on Monday the 15% pay rise for early educators was passed by this House. And a couple of hours ago, about 2 hours ago, the legislation to increase funding for our public schools was passed by this House. Both of these reforms are really important. That extra funding will be tied to things like phonics checks, numeracy checks, catch-up tutoring and extra mental health support, because we know that there's a real link between the mental health of students and how they perform at school. And that's also why the action that the Prime Minister and the Communications Minister are taking to end the doom scrolling and get our kids out of the cesspit of social media is so important. What we announced on the weekend is also important. We announced on the weekend that if we win the next election, the first piece of legislation we'll introduce will cut student debt for 3 million Australians by 20%. And I've told the House this week about what it will mean in different electorates and different communities right across the country, in the cities, in the suburbs, in the regions, in the bush. And this is what it will mean in places with some of the lowest incomes in the country. In Fowler, in the western suburbs of Sydney, which has the lowest median personal income in the country, more than 22,000 people will have their student debt cut. In Spence, in the northern suburbs of Adelaide, almost 20,000 people will have their student debt cut. In Caldwell, in the northwestern suburbs of Melbourne, almost 23,000 people will have their debt cut. And in Watson, More than 24,000 people in the electorate of Watson will have their debt cut. And in the community that I am so privileged to represent in this place, the electorate of Blaxland, almost 25,000 people will have their debt cut. These are people who know what education can do, how it can lift people up and help them to get ahead, help them to build the life that they deserve and that their family deserves. And they know that this Labor government has got their back and will cut their debt, unlike this anti-aspiration kick the ladder out behind the mob opposite, who are against them getting a tax cut and now are against them getting a debt cut. And Australians, these 3 million Australians now know that if Labor wins, they win. And if the Liberals win, they won't.
Far too much noise by the Leader of the Nationals and the member for Hume. They are now both warned. Give the call to the member for Cowper.
My question is to the Prime Minister. Can the Prime Minister confirm the 215 hardcore criminals released into the Australian community are receiving welfare and housing benefits at the expense of the Australian taxpayer?
Give a call to the Leader of the House. Member for Chisholm. The Leader of the House has the call.
Thanks very much, Mr Speaker. All the expenses, well, first of all, the greatest expense that any of these individuals have incurred is the cost of their crimes. That's the greatest expense, and that's why their visas were cancelled. That's why our first priority is for them to be out of the country. If they can't be out of the country, then we wanted them in detention, and the High Court has said that's not possible. The High Court has said for these particular individuals that they have given us a way of being able to use the forms of monitoring we wanted to use, but not under the specifics as to what had previously been approved by this parliament. And so that's what we are now having to do. But our priority, our first priority is always that we don't want these people in the country in the first place. The most expensive option is when they're in detention. The next most expensive option is when they're in the community. And the cheapest option is to get them out of the country. The arrangements when they're in the community and the expenses that are involved there are using procedures that were put in place and that existed for the entirety of their previous government.
The call to the honourable member for Macarthur.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Housing and Homelessness. How is the Albanese Labor government ensuring we have the skills to reach our target of 1.2 million homes, and how is the government's approach to building more homes different from the alternatives?
Call to the Minister for Housing and the Minister for Homelessness.
Speaker, I thank the member for Macarthur. He is a fierce advocate for housing for his constituents, but he's also one of the most loved people in the parliament. And Mike, it's great to get a question from you. Speaker, there's going to be a very clear choice at the upcoming election on housing between a Labor government which has brought the Commonwealth back to the table on this life-defining issue for millions of people, a government which is pulling every lever we have to build more homes, to help renters get a fairer deal and to help more Australians into home ownership, and an opposition which completely checked out of housing when they were in government and have consistently tried to stop our government from taking action on this matter. On this side of the House, we've set a bold and ambitious target of building 1.2 million houses over 5 years. Those opposite think boldness and ambition are a bad thing because they'd actually be held accountable for their failures. On this side of the House, we are investing a landmark $32 billion to combat a housing crisis that's been a generation in the making. Those opposite have said they'll cut $19 billion out of that program. What a dumb idea, cutting funding to housing in the middle of a housing crisis. On our side of the House, we're helping 35,000 tradies build the construction skills that we need through fee-free TAFE. On their side of the House, they call fee-free TAFE wasteful spending.
The Deputy Leader of the Opposition will cease
on our side of the House, we've helped 130,000 Australians into home ownership through an expanded home guarantee scheme. On their side, they managed just 60,000 in their decade in office. On this side of the House, we're investing in 55,000 social and affordable homes. We spent more on building new homes in our last budget than the entire 9 years of the Coalition combined. On this side of the House, we've
Order.
helped
The
a
Manager of
million
Opposition
Australians with a 45% increase in Commonwealth rent assistance. On their side, they didn't increase rent assistance once above CPI in a decade. Not once. Speaker, as housing, as on so many other things, there is a lot at stake at this upcoming election. We're in the middle of a big housing program to build more homes, get renters a fairer deal and help more Australians into home ownership. And we're in the middle of a big transformation about the way that the Commonwealth Government engages with housing. We've got a big, bold, positive agenda which is making real change for real people. All this progress will be at risk if this reckless, negative, aggressive opposition are elected to govern our country again.
We call to the honourable member for Wide Bay.
Thank you, Speaker. My question's to the Home Affairs Minister. Since releasing the 215 hardened criminals into the community, have any been charged with an act of sexual assault?
Call to the Leader of the House.
Mr Speaker, the records of what we've got there would be largely issues held by state and territory authorities. And if people are in, I don't have those stats in front of me. I don't have those in front of me. But what I will say is the concept of people on visas who have committed crimes previously being in the community with no restrictions is what used to happen. And that's why I give the example. You refer to those particular crimes. 102 convicted sex offenders were released with no conditions into the community from detention by the Leader of the Opposition. 64 child sex offenders were released with no conditions into the community by the Leader of the Opposition.
Has the Minister concluded his answer? The member for Blair has the call.
Speaker, my question is to the Minister for Infrastructure, Transport, Regional Development and Local Government. How is the Albanese Labor Government making housing more affordable by supporting infrastructure to get our homes built more quickly? What alternative approaches are there?
Call to the Minister for Infrastructure, Transport, Regional Development and Local Government.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and can I thank the member for Blair for his question. He represents an area of significant growth, and he knows that one of the keys to addressing the cost of living is bringing down the cost of owning or renting a home, and that means increasing housing supply. We are tackling the problem from every angle with a $32 billion plan, which is already building more homes today, helping people buy homes, massively increasing rent assistance and getting more social and affordable housing into the system. As part of the plan, we've put $1.5 billion over 2 years onto the table to tackle two of the biggest issues that are blocking housing supply: speeding up the planning processes and funding new infrastructure. We've already announced funding for projects to speed up planning, and we've put more development-ready sites into the pipeline. And that includes unlocking more land for housing in the rapidly growing Ipswich West region in the member's electorate, turning surplus land at the CSU campus in Rockhampton in the member for Capricornia's electorate into housing, fast-tracking housing development in the Riverland region in the member for Barker's electorate, getting faster approvals done for 45 new social homes in Yarrabah in the member for Leichhardt's electorate, and paying for the planning work for a new housing estate in Temora in the member for Riverina's electorate. And the Housing Support Program is also investing alongside state governments and state development agencies in a multitude of projects. They include $40 million to fund sewer, utilities and local roads, delivering 500 new homes in Meadowbrook in the rapidly growing southern suburbs of Brisbane. We've also announced $4.5 million for local road improvements to support 400 new homes in Knoxfield in the outer eastern suburbs of Melbourne. Now, I've seen those opposite have made some announcements in this space, announcements of their own. But buried in the fine detail, and you've always got to read the fine detail of that announcement, is the fact that those opposite are planning to fund enabling infrastructure with concessional loans to local councils, an approach that will force councils to raise rates or to levy developers to repay the loans, costs that will be passed on to future home owners. The Leader of the Opposition simply is not serious about fixing the housing crisis. We know they have committed to cutting $19 billion from housing, and now they are saying we'll pay for your infrastructure but only if we increase your rates and if we put your housing prices up because we're going to charge developers for it. You've always got to look at the detail with this, that man opposite. You've got to look at the detail. What we're building, they are blocking. Putting them in charge of housing affordability is simply too risky.
The call to the Leader of the Australian Greens.
Thank you, Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. Donald Trump's win is bad for women, bad for people of colour, bad for the climate and bad for democracy. Many people are terrified about what having this dangerous demagogue in charge will mean for the world, including here in Australia. To help keep Australia safe, will you now cancel the AUKUS nuclear submarine agreement so that we're not tied at the hip to Donald Trump?
The Prime Minister has the call.
Thanks, Mr Speaker. I thank the member for Melbourne for his question. We support the AUKUS arrangements because it is in Australia's national interest. If you think about Australia's defence and what is needed, what is required in terms of capability, as an island continent located where we are in the world, then shipping is obviously a key asset. And for Australia, when you look at how a country defends itself, there is no more effective way than through a submarine. If you look at what the most effective form of submarines are in terms of power, because of stealth, because of the amount of time that they can stay under the water, because of undetectability, because of the depth in which they can dive and how long they can stay under for. In terms of Australia's national interest, I was convinced, through proper briefings with the Defence Department and with defence officials that this is the correct way to go. And I continue to work with Mark Hammond, the Chief of Navy, the CDF and other defence personnel, the work that Jonathan Mead is doing as well, to ensure...
The Deputy Leader of the Opposition can leave the chamber under 94A. We're not going to have just people giving their commentary all throughout question time. There's far too much of it. I want everyone to show more respect and a little more restraint after this week. Prime Minister has the call.
Thanks, Mr Speaker. Well, I was speaking in support of AUKUS that I thought had bipartisan support across the chamber. It is in Australia's national interest and it's in our long-term interest. We have put in place phases so that we've already had a visit in Australia, a Virginia-class submarine that myself and the Defence Minister went into there at the base in Perth. We will have as well some Virginia-class submarines built in the United States, and then we will also have SSN AUKUS built, the same vessels built in the United Kingdom in Barrow, where I visited as well, and in South Australia. And what that will do, that isn't just about defence, that's about advanced manufacturing here in Australia. It has a massive spin-off as well that we're seeing through education, with many Australians engaging already in the United States and in the UK. So this is about Australia's national interest. I'll always stand up for Australia's national interest, and that is why I support this program.
Call to the member for Adelaide.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Mr Speaker, my question is to the Minister for the NDIS. What reforms has the Albanese Labor government made to the NDIS to get it back on track? And what changes are being made and what problems are being fixed to ensure that every dollar is supporting participants?
Call to the Minister for the National Disability Insurance Scheme and the Minister for Government Services.
I thank the tenacious member for Adelaide, whose win-loss ratio since 1998 elections has been 6-3. He never gives up. I'm pleased to update, though, the House and the people listening to question time about the progress of the NDIS. And I'm pleased to explain how Labor is building the NDIS's future. we're making sure that every dollar gets through to the participants for whom the scheme was designed. The NDIS is an important economic and social nation-building project, and it is helping people. Labor's been working to get the NDIS back on track every day since the last election. I acknowledge the work of people with disability and their supporters for their efforts too. There are definitely still problems with the scheme, but I can update the House on signs of progress. Participants who've been on the scheme for longer than 2 years who are aged more than 15 are reporting their community participations up. 15 to 24-year-olds report that their employment prospects or their jobs have increased from 10% to 22%, that in fact 51% of their parents and carers are now able to get, because of the NDIS, paid employment. I can also update the House on the financial green shoots of stabilisation. In the last year of the coalition, the scheme outlays grew by 23% and the number of people joining the scheme grew by 15%. Now the scheme outlays in the last financial year have grown by 18% and the number of people joining the scheme has stabilised at 8%. Next year we're on track for 12% and the following year 8%. I'm pleased to advise the House that even from the May budget to now, the outlays have decreased by $1 billion less than were expected in the May budget, which means that the scheme will invest over the next 4 years $210 billion in people, but not $229 billion. Now, there are reasons why this is happening. Firstly, the states have agreed that the NDIS shouldn't be the only lifeboat in the ocean. We've also started the overdue process of registering providers, of whom 90% of the scheme are unregistered. We've sorted out what you can and can't spend money on in the scheme, and we're sorting out a uniform assessment to make sure it's transparent how you're eligible for the scheme. We've invested in the agency and the Safeguards Commission, and we've also put people with disability in top leadership positions in these organisations. And finally, we're chasing the crooks. 519 investigations, 50 people before the courts, some of whom now in jail, over $1 billion in payments investigated. More payments are being scrutinised than ever. But I think the best news about the scheme is that Labor has led the reforms in this term, but we couldn't have got them through without the bipartisan support of the coalition. What this tells people with disability is that at least two of the parties in this House are committed to actually seeing the scheme be there for the future. And at fear of embarrassing the member for Deakin, he did a great job wrangling the litigious and soon-to-be-departed Liberal senators in his coalition to support us eventually. Under Labor, the NDIS is here to stay, and I acknowledge the work of the parliament to this goal.
Give the call to the honourable member for Durack.
Thank you. My question is to the Prime Minister. At Senate estimates, officials gave evidence that the Attorney-General released a convicted terrorist into the community by granting him parole. Prime Minister, what was this individual's offence? From which state or territory has he been released into? And does this individual pose a threat to the Australian public?
Order. Give the call to the Attorney-General. Order. Members on my left will cease to eject it.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. The safety of the community is the government's highest priority at all times, including when making parole decisions. And in relation to cases such as, I think the one that the member referred to, there is a very high threshold that must be met before a person can be granted parole. The decision is informed by advice from relevant agencies, and the safety of the community is the most important consideration in these decisions. Parole keeps the community safer. It means mandatory controls and mandatory supervision are in place which would otherwise not be available at the conclusion of someone's sentence. And the opposition knows that these decisions are informed by a range of expert assessments about an offender. They also know that individuals on parole are subject to strict supervision conditions which are informed by the advice of law enforcement and corrective services agencies. At all times, parolees are under the close supervision of state.
The Attorney-General was paused. He was asking about a specific I know where the member's going to go about a specific case, but I can't make him, as you know, under the standing orders, be directly answering the question on the specifics the member for Durack asked, but I will make sure he's being directly relevant to the question and talking about the parole process about this case is directly relevant. So I'm just going to remind the member for Tian, it's going to be really difficult to raise a point on relevance. In light of what I've said, the member for Wannon has the call.
Does go to relevance because the question asks what is the individual's offence, which state or territory, and most importantly, does this individual pose a threat to the Australian community? And the Attorney-General should answer the question.
The member for Moreton will leave the chamber under 94A. Because I want to hear from the Leader of the House.
Just to the point of order, the Attorney-General is going to the exact principles that are worked through by the government in making these decisions.
And he'll need to return to the question and ensure what he is addressing the House does remain directly relevant. It was a specific question. There is detail required, but I'm just going to ensure that he's being directly relevant. If he strays into any other topics, I will sit him down. The Attorney-General has the call.
Very much, Mr Speaker. The opposition know that individuals on parole are subject to strict supervision conditions which are informed by the advice of law enforcement and corrective services agencies. At all times, parolees are under the close supervision of state and territory corrective services agencies. I can also advise the House that when in government, those opposite made similar decisions to release offenders on parole. As the Attorney-General's Department advised Senate estimates just 2 days ago, a Liberal Attorney-General and a Liberal Assistant Minister released 3 offenders on parole between 2020 and 2022.
The Attorney-General will pause. The Manager of Opposition Position on a point of order.
Well, Mr Speaker, you've given a clear direction to the Attorney-General. Now, Standing Order 91C makes it clear that a member's conduct is disorderly if they willfully refuse to conform to a standing order, and that is what the Attorney-General is doing.
So to get through this, you're going to need to make it directly relevant to the question, either through the Senate estimates part of the question, without simply talking about alternative policies or the previous government. So I'll give the Attorney-General one more chance. If he strays beyond that, I want him to listen carefully to me, he will have to return to his seat.
Thank you, Mr Speaker.
The Attorney-General has the call.
We are not going to talk about the details of individual offenders, and it is very disappointing to see the opposition seeking to politicise what is an important part of the criminal justice system, particularly when it is a part of the criminal justice system that the former government utilised, which I include in that the 3 offenders released between 2020 and 2022 who were convicted of online child sexual offences and people smuggling.
Attorney-General will resume his seat. He's finished his answer. Well, he has now. The member for Lyons has the call.
Thank you, Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Health. Why is bulk billing important in Medicare, and what pressure has bulk billing faced in the past? What has the Albanese Labor government been doing to promote more bulk billing?
Call to the Minister for Health and Aged Care.
Thank you, Speaker. I thank my friend, the member for Lyons, who joined us earlier this year, the Prime Minister, many of us, at the 40th anniversary of Australia's most important social program, Medicare. Medicare was hard fought, Mr Speaker. It was opposed tooth and nail at the time by doctors' groups and by the Liberal Party, who election after election after election promised to abolish it. But for Labor, bulk billing was right at the heart of our vision for Medicare. But again, that was hard fought. The AMA instructed its members not to bulk bill for a long time, and we know John Howard, the Leader of the Opposition at the time then, described bulk billing as an absolute rort. And although we won that fight as well, Mr Speaker, the truth is that those opposite have maintained their lack of support for bulk billing right through the intervening years. The Leader of the Opposition, of course, said that there were too many free Medicare services and then tried to abolish bulk billing altogether for everyone. And when we blocked that change in the other place, Mr Speaker, he then kicked off a 6-year freeze to the Medicare rebate that ripped billions and billions of dollars out of general practice, causing bulk billing to wither on the vine. And then, rather than having the courage to own the damage that they had inflicted on Medicare, they tried to fudge the figures, Mr Speaker, magically producing a bulk billing figure of 88% on the eve of the last election. Well, the Vice President of the College of GPs called them out, describing that 88% figure, and I quote, as misleading and significantly skewed. And shortly after the election, Mr Speaker, the college president, Dr Price, described the reality this way. She said bulk billing was in free fall and that general practice was at a tipping point. So maybe instead of holding up a sign like he did yesterday with this misleading figure scribbled with crayon on it, the Leader of the Opposition might reflect on his own role in creating this utter mess. And if he doesn't get it, I tell you what, Australia's doctors do, Mr Speaker. They ranked him as the worst health minister in 35 years in a poll of doctors. Australian Doctor magazine says, and I quote, 1,100 doctors took part in the survey and quoted one GP as saying Mr Dutton will be remembered as the dullest, least innovative and most gullible. Well, we've got a different approach. We're committed to cleaning up his mess, to strengthening Medicare, to reversing the slide in bulk billing. And in just 12 months, we've delivered 5.4 million additional free visits to the doctor. More doctors, more bulk billing, more urgent care clinics. That's our approach to strengthening Medicare.
The call to the member for McKellar.
Thank you, Speaker. My question is for the Minister for Defence Industry. On the 28th of October, Israel's parliament voted to ban UNRWA from the country within 90 days. With aid trucks entering Gaza already at less than 7% of pre-war levels and with no viable alternative to UNRWA, the Secretary-General of Médecins Sans Frontières has said that this ban will have catastrophic implications for people in Gaza and the West Bank now and for generations to come. What is Australia doing to ensure that the people of Gaza do not die of starvation and preventable diseases such as polio? Thank you.
Call to the Minister for Defence Industry and Capability Delivery, the Minister for International Development of the Pacific and the Minister representing the Minister for Defence and the Minister for Foreign Affairs.
Thank you, Speaker, and I thank the member for her question. Let me begin by condemning the attacks of October 7 and the resulting war and civilian deaths. We call for an immediate release of all hostages, for an immediate ceasefire and for the free and unfettered flow of humanitarian aid. UNRWA does life-saving work, and that's why successive Australian governments have funded it since 1951. The humanitarian situation in Gaza is catastrophic, and only UNRWA has the mandate and the infrastructure to receive and distribute aid on the scale that's needed right now. UNRWA has also been subject to several external investigations in light of the October 7 attacks, including by former French Foreign Minister Catherine Colonna and the UN Office of Internal Oversight Services, who concluded that UNRWA was the critical backbone of humanitarian services in Gaza and that there was no proof of systematic terrorism links. No proof of systematic terrorism links. And importantly, UNRWA is implementing all recommended reforms. And as the Foreign Minister said in Senate estimates earlier today, the simple reason why we support UNRWA is because we don't want innocent Palestinian civilians to starve to death. It's as simple as that. We call on Israel to allow free, unfettered humanitarian access to Gaza in line with the International Court of Justice ruling. Now, the questioner has asked what we are doing. Firstly, we joined with Canada, France, Germany, Japan, South Korea and the UK to urge Israel's Knesset to not proceed with the legislation to ban UNRWA. And we've also made our opposition clearly known directly to Israeli authorities in Tel Aviv and Canberra following the legislation's passage. We continue to work through diplomatic channels in Tel Aviv, through the UN and here in Canberra to urge immediate and open access for aid workers and supplies. We've provided a total of $94.5 million in humanitarian funding to the region since October 23. This includes $6 million to UNRWA, which continues to flow, along with the other partner agencies we've funded in Gaza, including UNICEF, the World Food Programme, the Red Cross, the UN Operations Services and the UN Population Fund. And we've also provided our regular annual contribution of $20 million to UNRWA. So to the member's question, we'll continue to urge a reversal of this decision. We'll continue to support urgent humanitarian aid to the region, and we continue to stand by and urge everyone for an immediate ceasefire and urgent humanitarian assistance to our region. Thank you.
The call to the honourable member for Chisholm.
Thank you so much, Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. How will cutting student debt and making fee-free TAFE permanent and other cost of living measures help build a stronger future? What other approaches are there?
Give the call to the Prime Minister.
I thank the member for Chisholm for her question. Indeed, this Labor government is about building Australia's future. We announced on Sunday we'll cut student debt by 20%. We'll raise the HECS repayment threshold, putting more dollars in the pockets of graduates. We'll make free TAFE permanent. 3 million Australians will get relief on their debt. 100,000 Australians getting free TAFE every year. Because when the government invests in education, every Australian benefits.
Order. Now, the Prime Minister reports there's just far too much noise in the chamber. We're just going to get through the order. Members, the member for New England is now warned. We've got 6 people on warnings. Don't try your luck. The Prime Minister has the call.
Those opposite, Mr Speaker, have the arrogance to look at young Australians and say, you should pay more. That is what they are saying. We want to strengthen our nation. Those opposite don't, and that's the difference. What makes Australia stronger is free TAFE, so it's easier for more Australians to become tradies, carers, IT specialists. Who's against it? They are. What makes Australia stronger is cutting student debt. Who's against it? They are. Giving every Australian taxpayer a tax cut. Who's against it? They are. Cheaper childcare. Who's against it?
Order.
Energy bill relief for every household. Who's against it?
Order.
Getting wages moving again. Who's against it? Bringing back manufacturing and making more things here. Who's against it? More affordable housing and building more homes. Who's against it? Mr Speaker, we are building Australia's future, investing in cost of living relief at the same time as we have halved inflation since we came to office. But those opposite don't cheer for Australia, they cheer against Australia. They are never more depressed as when good figures come out showing that inflation is going down, wages are going up, a million jobs created. And just one of our cost of living measures has had a new figure this week, Mr Speaker, because our cheaper medicines that were opposed by those opposite have now ticked over to have saved Australians $1 billion. $1 billion. Measures that those opposite oppose, like they have opposed every single cost of living measure that we have put forward. We've done all of that, Mr Speaker, while turning their massive Liberal deficits into 2 Labor budget surpluses. We'll continue to build Australia's future. They'll continue to be the great blockers, Mr Speaker. And on that note, I ask that further questions be placed on the notice paper.